For those who don't know you, could you introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Stephen Cavallaro. I'm a senior encounter designer on the World of Warcraft team, and I helped bring the Mega Dungeon Dawn of the Infinite to life.
Hello, my name is Morgan Day. I am one of the associate game directors on World of Warcraft. And apparently I am red/purple at the moment. I'll see if I can't fix my webcam. Sorry about that. Oh, wait, it just
There it
fixed itself.
goes. Okay. Well, yes, we're here to talk about the Mega Dungeon. I'm very excited. I love Mega Dungeons in general, and I love the Infinite Dragon. So this is the peanut butter sandwich for me coming together. The Mega Dungeon, as we've seen on the PTR, we start going right in hot pursuit after the current threat. So clearly, there's some story that leads up to that. Based on that, are we going to see the Mega Dungeon right on the opening of the patch, or is it something that we will need to do some story before we unlock it?
Yeah, so the goal here is to be able to go into the Mega Dungeon on release and be able to experience, the encounters and the story in there. There is questing content prior, at least at this time. And Morgan, if this is something that you maybe can shed light on, the actual requirement to do a breadcrumb quest to enter the Mega Dungeon is not something that would prevent you from actually doing it. So yeah, we want players to be able to feel like they can get in that content right away. But yeah, there is some lead up quest lines, including involving one of the characters found in Dawn of the Infinite, Morchi, and you get to kind of see some of her stuff early. Of course, Morchi is the evil version of Chromie, the infinite version of Chromie. So
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with Mega Dungeons, I want to say all the way back in Legion when we added Return to Karazhan, there was, kind of like the old school attunement quests, right? Where you had to kind of complete the quest before you could zone in. But that was something that we pretty quickly, heard feedback on from the players. They just want to log in and play with their friends and do the stuff, right? So we still have a lot of really cool questing surrounding the Mega Dungeon, but that stuff is all optional. It's not something that would be required for you to do before or after you complete it.
And so with the Mega Dungeon, obviously those have been very story driven. We've been chasing outlaws through Tazavesh, and we have been trying to find like the answers in Mechagon. But with this one, it's a segment of the story, but it's not the complete story. There's some stuff that happens before, and without going into spoilers, it seems like the story continues after the dungeon. Are we going to be seeing stories kind of gated like we saw with 10.1 point 5, or sorry, rather 10.1 with the raid, where there was story before and after? Or is it going to be just all like one big chunk that we can eat right away?
So yeah, certainly following the completion of Dawn of the Infinite, there will be some follow up, some quests and some stuff that would be, part of future content updates as well. But I think we really wanted to make sure that the bulk of the story we're telling with this content update occurs, before and then into and during Dawn of the Infinite itself. And so, kind of as I guess going back a little bit, there's sort of two main plot lines, right, that are sort of converging right now in the Dragonflight story. And one of them is the Bronze Dragonflight's plot line with Chromie trying to protect her leader. There's Dormu from sort of this ultimate fate of becoming Murazond. And there's the Primal Incarnate storyline. In particular interest to this content update, Fractures in Time, Iridikron's plot and what he wants to do, what his plan is. And so ultimately, with Dawn of the Infinite, we're sort of bringing those storylines together and trying to tell more about Iridikron's motivations, but also sort of trying to really go into whether or not Chromie can stop those Dormu from becoming Murazond. And you'll see that play out during Dawn of the Infinite. And we're super excited about being able to sort of take that mainline plot and introduce it in a mega dungeon in a way that we haven't really done before. Previous mega dungeons have had some really cool side storylines, but this is really the main driving plot of Dragonflight being pushed forward here.
Yeah, and on top of that, as we mentioned, there would be questing before, but also there are some quests that open up that and become available once you've completed the mega dungeon. Also, I don't want to get into spoilers here, but the community is kind of come to love and appreciate a lot of these really awesome IGCs and the videos that come out alongside this content. And there were definitely some encrypted things that players will have to wait until the launch of Fractures in Time to see. But additionally, in addition to that, kind of a also we're doing something a little bit unique in a similar vein that normally the mega dungeons come out with the major patches, and where this time we're doing it in .5 with Fractures in Time. We want players to be able to experience this from a story perspective, as even for the player type who might not be who might not normally do a lot of the kind of organized, more challenging content. So we're actually going to be splitting the mega dungeon in two, similar to what we've done in the past, but much earlier than we have in the past. We're going to be adding the of ability to queue for heroic Dawn of the Infinite as two kind of halves of a dungeon in 10.1.7. So that will be right, kind of around the corner after we come out with Fractures in Time, where people will be able to experience that, even if they're not, even if they don't want to do it, as a mythic mega dungeon.
Wow. Okay, so it's coming in 10.1.7. My assumption would have been that it would have been with the next season that we would have gotten both the split for heroic versions and for possibly Mythic Plus. Actually, that is a question. Are we going to see this in the Mythic Plus rotation in the next season?
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, that was part of the motivation there with splitting the dungeon into the heroic for 10.1.7 was one, we want to see this go into the season 3 Mythic Plus pool, but also, as Steven mentioned, this is a really important thrust of the story for Dragonflight. So we want players to be able to experience that prior to going into the next season.
Okay. Now, the other part of it is that when you're doing it as the one big chunk mega dungeon, that has a lot of difficulties, mainly, getting a team together that can go through all of that. And when the difficulty of the actual encounters is higher, sometimes you get some teams that can't fully complete it. Is this dungeon relatively as challenging as previous mega dungeons, or where have you guys kind of positioned it?
Yeah, I think this is definitely a really interesting kind of thing to think about, and it's something that we try to do in terms of, like with Dawn of the Infinite, think about ways to service different buckets of the community in different ways to make sure that all our players feel satisfied with the content offering that they have. One of the things that we're actually doing differently with Dawn of the Infinite compared to the other mega dungeons is we are intentionally releasing it at a difficulty level that will require more coordination that is similar to raids. It's more of a smaller raid like experience for a smaller group of players, and we are doing that because there's definitely been outreach in the community asking for more smaller sized instanced content that is still challenging, because not everyone either has the time or has the I mean, a variety of reasons why you might not be able to raid with a 20-person team on a weekly basis, on a scheduled basis, right? But you still want to do challenging end game content for meaningful rewards, and so this was a way to sort of offer that. And I think it's a nice juxtaposition to something like Mythic Plus, which we're super excited about and happy about. But there's a timer. It's a very different type of experience than you might have like in a traditional raid, where you're like progressing through bosses and you're learning encounters and you're spending 5 minutes talking to each other about, okay, what do we want to try this time? Let's strategize. Let's think about how we want to try to approach this. And so we wanted to try to take that experience and have it in Dawn of the Infinite at launch. And so you might be familiar with how previous mega dungeons like Tazavesh have had like a hard mode that you could turn on, right? With Dawn of the Infinite, that's essentially baked in to the dungeon. It is how it is at launch. It is the default difficulty. It is notably, more difficult than a regular mythic dungeon. But to reiterate Morgan's point, this is why we felt it was so important for us to get heroic out sooner in 10.1.7 than we normally would, because we do want to make sure that we're allowing all of our players to experience the content, because it has some important story elements. It's a mainline storytelling device for us, and so it's important that we got that out earlier to coincide with the increase in difficulty. And I mentioned it as well, but we are aware that if we're going to have an increase in difficulty, we want to make sure that players feel rewarded. So the rewards this time around are going to be comparative to like Tazavesh, for example, more powerful. It's something that we think is important. And as an example, the power level of the gear will be sort of around what you would expect to drop from an end of raid heroic boss. And that's sort of the level of power that's being targeted. But I think even beyond just the raw item level, we're trying some interesting things with like different effects on some of the items to make them feel thematically tied to Dawn of the Infinite, to the idea of time and time travel. And so I think a lot of players will find some of those effects to be interesting and unique, and they'll want to pick them up and play around with them, sort of regardless of the item level itself. And then even beyond that, we want to make sure that players that are interested in cosmetics like proto dragon companion skins or transmog, collectors, have something to go for in there as well. And so as an example, you'll be able to collect infinite dragonflight dragon scales for your proto dragon companions. There's some secrets we don't want to really talk too much about, but I think that transmog fans and collectors will be excited about some things that are going to be in there as well. So I think there's a lot for players to sort of get in terms of rewards from running Dawn of the Infinite, and we're very excited about seeing how players sort of engage with the content on release with that more sort of social and coordination heavy aspect.
You just answered a ton of my questions in that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate when people go deep like that. Another part to it is that when you're going through this dungeon, you can see that there's like a lot of mini bosses and different events that are like sort of mixing it up. So when you're like designing these encounters, was that like a very obviously it's a deliberate thing. You design things deliberately, but what's the inspiration behind that? Are you trying to like mix up the meta for dungeons?
Yeah, I think particularly when you have longer form content like this, you want to have these moments of breakup, right, in the gameplay. You want to have some fresh moments that, it's always fun to fight different creatures, but after a while it's like, can we think of sort of a twist on what we're doing here to kind of freshen up the experience. And so you might be familiar with one of sort of the major things regarding that in Dawn of the Infinite is this sort of gauntlet you have to run through. It starts in the second half of the dungeon, and you have to sort of run through a bunch of these infinite dragonflight that are trying to like stop you, and you have the speed boost from Chromie, and it's a non-combat moment, but it's a fun twist on our gameplay, and it trying to interject things like that. I think we feel is important to help. It's not even just about freshening up the experience. It's about making the experience feel more immersive and more alive. Like, just different ways to interact with characters. Like, for example, having a reason for Chromie to give you that speed boost. It feels in line with what you'd expect from Chromie. She's supporting you. And it's just ways to try to integrate all that in a sequence that feels satisfying for players. And you mentioned, there's some little set piece moments, like you land and a infinite drake comes flying and lands in front of you, and those little things I think help a lot to sell the experience as an experience beyond just the gameplay.
Yeah, there are those moments that are a little more cinematic, definitely more immersive. There are also a couple of bosses that are challenging if you're not paying attention. So thinking of Chromie and when we're dealing with our evil counterpart Morchi, there is a mechanic where you are tracking to figure out which one has the debuff. Is this something where you are trying specifically to combat people using like weak auras just to be like, that's the one, go after it?
Yeah, I think when we design mechanics like that, we try to come up with new ways for players to like read and react to situations, right? Something that's maybe different than, dodging a swirly on the ground, or, things that players are very familiar with. And so mechanics like this are just a way for us to kind of harken back to my last answer, a way to sort of freshen up the play pattern and the thinking pattern that players have to do. With that being said, we always take into account like accessibility, and we want to make sure that players feel like they're able to parse information in a way that is reasonable. And so that type of stuff always comes from tuning and making sure that we feel that players have enough time to make the decision of which Morchi is the real Morchi and things like that. So yeah, I think in terms of combating weak auras and whatnot. I think it's just for us, it's more about just introducing different ways for players to make a decision about what they're actually looking at on screen and like what they're seeing a character do, and then they see that and they're able to make what feels like a cool decision, right? Like I literally am watching this character do an animation and I'm making a gameplay decision about that. We think that's a fun gameplay pattern.
Also, I mean, as Steven's touched on a couple times, like when we think of mega dungeons, a lot of what we discuss and with amongst ourselves is like they're like mini raids, right? They're like a small raid. But not only do we mean that when we talk about it from just the pure cinematic and storytelling aspect, and the duration of it, it's an 8 boss dungeon. That's pretty awesome. But also from the perspective of the mechanical choices that the team makes, right? That amount of coordination that you might require from a raid is also something that you would see in a mega dungeon, where normally we have a pretty clean line almost in the sand where, all right, this is a dungeon mechanic, thou shalt not use that in a dungeon, it's okay to use it in a raid. Where this is more, we think of it as a mini raid, not only from from multiple perspectives, as well as the amount of coordination that we might expect, all the way up to things of like the duration of the encounter, right? Like a normal dungeon boss we might have, we usually aim for like a 2-minute mark, where mega dungeon bosses we talk about being quite a bit longer than that in terms of duration, which also frees up more time or gives you more time to experiment with things like phase changes and stuff like that. So really, it's an opportunity for the team to do some awesome stuff there.
Along the lines of thinking of this as a raid encounter, when you're balancing a raid, especially at the higher difficulties where you can bank on a certain amount of people, you're able to bank on particular utility. But in a 5-man team, there's no chance that a team can be guaranteed to have specific utility. How do you like offset that in your balancing? Is it just that this is a separate category of no, we can't do this because there's no way that they could have a priest or a Drac there to do the rescue / grip, or like what's the thought process when you're doing those encounter designs?
Definitely. I mean, we certainly want to make sure that regardless of the level of coordination required, that we're being accessible to all of our players, and that means all of their classes and their specs. I think we certainly want to still represent in some encounters, some specs or classes might have a specific moment to really shine, but that does not mean that it's like a requirement for them to be there. That's certainly not something that we would intentionally want to do with, like you mentioned, a smaller group like this, because it's with less people, there's that much more of an impossibility that you can assume every class is going to be there. Obviously it's not possible because there's only 5 people. So definitely when we're balancing in terms of coordination, we like to think more about general gameplay roles, not so much specific specs or classes when it comes to a smaller group size. Like, for example, knowing that a mechanic might have a window where it would be good to have a group buff that buffs damage, right? There's a lot of classes and specs that can do that. I mean, in particular, augmentation of Ochre will be able to do that, obviously, but there's shamans with heroism or bloodlust. Lots of classes can do a haste buff at this point. So it's things like that where we know that we have combat roles that are not literally like being a tank, healer, DPS, but there are moments for that type of class and gameplay pattern to shine. But it's certainly not something that we feel is a requirement, nor should it be.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, philosophically, when we talk about encounter design, we think of it as creating a puzzle for the players to solve, right? And often when we discuss that, we want there to be a lot of different ways to approach these encounters. We don't really feel like the best approach is to say, this is exactly how you beat this fight. You must cast this exact spell, right? Because then there's not much discovery there. The player lacks a lot of agency in if we approach things like that way, versus like, hey, you've got a bunch of tools. You can solve this in a number of different ways. Like as long as you've got some form of mobility, you can kind of counteract this ability. And lots of classes have mobility options, right? So really we look at it as we're creating interesting puzzles. The combat team is giving us really fun tools and utility that we can then leverage. And often we'll try to find ways to create as many potential possibilities in terms of how you solve that problem amongst your own group, because that's a lot of fun interactions with like the talent system pop up in that regard, right? Where when you walk up to an encounter, you're like, ooh, okay, hold on. We just wiped, but I bet if I change my spec around a little bit here, that'll give us the tools now to counteract that ability that we might not have had last attempt. So really that kind of interplay between the core classes and the encounters is what really creates a lot of exciting gameplay.
Conversely, when you're looking at doing affixes in Mythic Plus, that seems like it would add additional constraints on how you would design things. Thinking back to Season 1, how you had to create certain areas or times where Thundering couldn't trigger, just so you wouldn't have like those unfortunate lineups. Obviously, that's a recent example, but there's obviously gameplay examples that would be like that, like Sanguine happening right when you get pulled into something or whatever. Do you have like a sort of list of mechanics that you don't do because you've now introduced new affixes?
You mean specifically for the like Season 2 dungeons, or do you mean with Dawn of the Infinite?
With Dawn of the Infinite, but I guess it's more a general philosophy when you're designing now, is that you're looking at designing Dawn of the Infinite and you say, okay, I don't want to have this thing happen because Afflicted might happen, or we can't have a bunch of speed mobility things because right then and there you could get entangling, and that can cause like, the bad luck. Everybody complains because the dungeon screwed me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly, we removed quaking, for instance, with Season 2, but that was one of those areas where like, you would constantly kind of see like the community posts of the little video of like, look at this boss mechanic right as quaking hit and we all died. What did you want from me, game? Right. So yeah, those are certainly areas where we are always taking into consideration how those interactions might kind of play together. So we discussed that as we are building dungeons, certainly. So Dawn of the Infinite, I'm sure that's something that the group has been discussing. But yeah, there are for sure areas where we look at design options and try to think of how can we incorporate as much potential class utility as possible, right? Like I want to say it's Afflicted, right, where that is an affix that was added, that there's actually a lot of different ways to approach that problem. Like it's not just this one specific thing solves it. There's a lot of alternative ways to approach that problem. So yeah, that's often something that the group talks about for sure.
Well, I know you guys are squeezed for time, so I just want to ask one last question before I let you go. These dungeons, mega dungeons, have been such a great success, and people love them. You guys are pumping out content faster than ever before. Is there a point where you're going to consider doing more than one mega dungeon in a particular expansion, without promising anything?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, we love exploring the mega dungeon space. That's one of the joys of World of Warcraft, is that there's such a wide breadth of players and content that they find interesting, right? So like there's the players that love raids and the players that love dungeons or the outdoor world. So we're always looking to create content and an experience that is as satisfying for as diverse and broad a range of players as possible. So often we just kind of follow follow our nose, what makes sense for the story, but also what kind of content do we think would be exciting right now for the player base. And that's something that we will continue to philosophically kind of guide us and determine kind of what direction the content goes in the game. But as with all things in World of Warcraft, community feedback is tremendously valuable to us, and we're always listening and excited to hear what the players think about the content we're building and what else they would find fun and interesting.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time. Speaking for myself, I love mega dungeons. I love dungeons in general, so any dungeons that release after the initial 8 so far is eagerly anticipated by myself and many of my friends.
Great.
Awesome to hear. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, Manny.
Have a
Yeah,
good day,
thanks.
guys.